Well, and welcome to this CommieCast, the podcast series which talks about the issues which matter to you. Tonight, we're going to be talking about democracy, local, regional, and national. And I have two comrades here from the party in Scotland and the party in Wales. First, we're going to talk to Johnnie Hunter up in Scotland. Johnnie, before we begin, tell us a wee bit about yourself, sir.
Hi there, comrade. I'm Johnnie Hunter. I'm based up here in Glasgow. I'm the General Secretary of the Young Communist League. I'm also a member of the party's Scottish Committee. And in my professional life, I'm a solicitor and I'm a shop steward.
Okay, mate, you sound like a very busy guy. First, how do you define democracy? And also, after you've done that, go ahead and talk about this overarching phrase that we use to describe our approach, progressive federalism. How would you define that for us?
So, two big questions, I think it would be fair to say, and I'll do my best to keep it brief. I think as communists, we are democrats in the fullest sense of the word. I think that we believe in a truly democratic society. And what do we mean by that term democracy? Because it's used, and I would say probably abused a lot, certainly in the right wing and in the monopoly media. For communists, we mean that society should be controlled and ran by and in the interests of working people. That decisions at every level, from local communities all the way up, should be based on collective, popular and engaging forms of decision making. A democratic society for communists is one that operates not just in the interests of the working classes in Britain, but also our planet and all of humanity. So, as I said, we're told that Britain is a democracy today. And indeed, the media would have you think that Britain's one of the most democratic societies in the world. But the truth is that Britain isn't a democracy, never has been. The ruling class parliamentary system that we have is set up to obscure who really holds power, and that's the rich and big business. It's there to provide an illusion of real democracy. But in that struggle for communists and socialists to do away with capitalism, we have always argued that it's fundamentally important to defend and advance what limited, hard-won democratic rights working people do have in Britain. Well, it never allowing ourselves to foster the illusion that there can be real democracy under capitalism. And a key part of that struggle in Britain, and for us here in Scotland, is to win for the Scottish Parliament full economic, legislative and financial powers to protect and develop the economic, social and cultural interests of working people in Scotland. The power to intervene in the economy, to protect jobs and to develop our communities. And Britain's communists continue to campaign for what you alluded to, progressive federalism, as the best way of achieving and advancing these democratic rights while also developing class cohesion across the nations of Britain. So for us, that would involve national parliaments for Scotland and Wales, and also parliaments for the regions of England with the powers of economic intervention and ownership, but also a federal parliament at the all Britain level with the power to intervene in economic policy and also, crucially, to redistribute wealth in terms of social need. So for communists, we believe that progressive federalism provides that best framework for uniting working people on class terms against the state power of big business.
Right, thanks very much indeed for that, mate. Interesting, a couple of years ago, I read a report on democracy in various parts of the world, and the United States scored very low as a democracy because they recognized that basically it's a big business that runs the country. I think they call it the blob. You've basically got the financial sector, the military-industrial complex, and you have the fossil fuel lobby. And when you look at what's happening in Ukraine now, I don't think you can really understand it unless you fully try and comprehend what that blob, all right, the bankers, the industrial complex, the military complex, and indeed the fossil fuel people, particularly liquefied natural gas, are doing. So, yeah, an interesting perspective. David, over to you, sir. First of all, give us a wee introduction and then we'll talk about your perspective from a Welsh viewpoint.
My name is David Morgan, and I work in local government up in the north of Wales, in Cymru. And I am the secretary of the Communist Party in Wales. For me, I think democracy is simply about groups of ordinary people coming together to make decisions collectively about the allocation of resources, time and effort, the big decisions that affect people's lives. And I think there's very little of that taking place in Wales today. I think by and large these decisions are decided by exploitation, money and market systems and allocation. I think over that we've placed a sort of veneer of democratic institutions, as Johnny's mentioned. I think we see very little power in those institutions. I think the elections degenerate into personality contests, and there's very little engagement in the public with key questions of policy, or actually any direct route for ordinary people to influence the major decisions. Seems to me, by and large, it is either a vote for no change, a vote for a worsening in the current trend, or some minor adjustment where there's no guarantee that you'll have the power to carry out that adjustment. I think the history of bourgeois democracy in Wales is largely the history of a mild but nonetheless thwarted descent, essentially, of elected Labour majorities constrained by the usually Tory Westminster.
Johnny, over to you, mate. How do you characterise the current institutional arrangements in the UK regarding democracy? And how do they fail to meet that definition of democracy which you've given? And how do they aggravate the wider problems of capitalism for the people of the country?
So I think one thing that's been made very clear to working people across Britain during this pandemic is just how corrupted to its very core the political system that we have in this country is. You see that from the preferential treatment that's given to political donors to the major parties, to the tap and the shoulder appointments in the civil service, and the billions that we've seen handed to profiteering private sector firms throughout the pandemic. You've also got, I think, as Dave alluded to and mentioned there, the role of the privately owned monopoly media in this, and also state outlets like the BBC. They do play a fundamental role in keeping this whole pantomime running, narrowing the scope of the political debate and lowering the general political and intellectual level of public discussion. And, we see it very consistently, distracting working people from what we would say are the real fundamental issues of the hour. Here in Scotland, it was communists that led the call for a Scottish Parliament, and obviously that's an important element of the democratic struggle for us. It was communists, socialists, and the STUC up here that led that struggle. But after 20 years, we would say that's a parliament that's failed to live up to that potential or to be a truly positive force for working people. On the one hand, the parliament still lacks many of the powers needed to allow it to intervene decisively in the economy. And on the other hand, there's also the absence of political will from the ruling class political parties that hold power there to make any form of radical change. What we've seen consistently is that neoliberal and right-wing policies have been the consensus. And we often have the situation up here in Scotland with the SNP government where they're given a sort of carte blanche because they can escape any criticism really just by being slightly less bad than the Tories. And I think that lesser of two evils dynamic is really a very dangerous trap for working people. And that's something that we saw during the pandemic and the mirror and incompetence that you've seen between Holyrood and Westminster. And right down at the local level, what little local democracy that we once had in Scotland that did allow councils to make progressive change for working people has been viciously stripped away. And we've seen that over the decades by the Tories and also by the SNP, who've centralised government in Britain to an unprecedented extent, really. And, a big part of that has been shackling local authorities to make sure that they're adhering to free competition rules on public procurement and state aid. And these are all rules that favour big monopolies and stop local councils and other bodies developing local economies centred on building sustainable communities.
Okay, thank you for that, comrade. David, give us your perspective on that from a Welsh viewpoint, please.
Yeah, and like Johnny pointed out, the communists in Wales have been at the forefront of the battle for a parliament for Wales. But what we have in the devolution settlement for Wales, again, is quite a few parallels with what Johnny's mentioned. I think in particular, the lack of powers to implement and the lack of will to implement radical change is something that we see as well. I think in particular, I mean, where there has been a will to put forward some challenge to the status quo, it frequently it resolves around a kind of a battle between Welsh and UK government. We've seen with the Welsh commitment to an agricultural wages board, the UK government challenging the attempt of the Welsh government to support workers in that field through the courts, where the UK government has brought forward anti-trade union legislation. The Welsh government has responded with a fair work agenda, which is incapable of actually reversing or altering the major problems with what's been proposed or what's been implemented from the UK government. And then similarly on welfare reform, where the Welsh government admitted very directly that its role was to mitigate the worst examples, the worst elements of the UK government's reform through things like the short-lived Welsh independent living grant, housing policy, council tax relief, and so on. So it's really a story of conflict, but sort of impotent conflict between the different layers of government. But even though this conflict's taken place, devolution has had some success. It's clear that there's a massive way to go, massive scope for opening up a democracy. That's not what's happening. In fact, we're facing an attack on devolution through the UK Single Market Act, the levelling up agenda. What we're seeing there is that public investment will be channeled directly into the hands of big business capital. We're seeing that the delivery of services will be determined by partnerships where big business have been guaranteed a seat, and where even policies such as economic development, education and skills, community development that were devolved are now being usurped, essentially, by the UK government, who are riding roughshod over the powers that we did formerly have in Wales.
Okay, thank you, mate. Johnny, back to you. Broadly speaking, I see people in this country think they can't do anything about the situation. It's a kind of version of the "'twas ever thus" mentality. This is the way things are. We can't do anything to change it. And that, of course, is just what exactly the ruling class want us to think. Do you see that progressive federalism, by bringing the centres of power closer to the people, can encourage more participation and active, valuable participation in the democratic process? Is that a fair characterisation?
I think that we've seen, for all the faults in the devolution process so far, it certainly has been the case that we're, the power over decision making is closer and more directly held by the people that it directly affects. That does motivate participation, and that does motivate a greater belief in the use of collective strength to intervene and make progressive changes. I suppose the real tragedy that we've seen in Scotland and in other parts of Britain, while there might have been on paper this transfer of power, or at least of some limited powers over some specific aspects of government, the reality is that through neoliberal policies, and also previously through EU rules, and also through the austerity agenda, it's meant that local decision makers have had, in reality, very little power to intervene and to make these changes. Their hands have been tied either directly through law and regulation from Westminster or Brussels, or they've been tied de facto by the starving of funds from local authorities and also from bodies like the Scottish Parliament. So as well as creating the formal structures and transferring power to the national parliaments and back to local authorities, Scotland's communists are also saying that one of the fundamental fights that we face is the fight for popular sovereignty, a rebirth of democracy as it really should be, and that's government by the people in our communities, workplaces, regions, and nations. That's people power over the economy, not the reverse. And we're also clear that not only does that require the formal statutory powers to make these changes, but it also requires investment in communities, investment in the regions and nations. We are clear that to achieve that fight for popular sovereignty, we do need not a separatist movement that's narrowly focused in Scotland, but an alliance between working people across Britain. Britain's one of the most unequal countries in the world, socially and geographically, and it's fundamental in the Communist Party's view that we redistribute wealth and power across and within it. But again, for that we need an alliance of working people between the regions and nations, and that's why one of the Communist Party's immediate goals in this context is progressive federalism.
Right, thank you. So I'm certainly getting the picture that we basically want the economy to work for everybody, not just for the few people that are in control of the economy. And progressive federalism is all about creating the institutions that will make that goal possible. David, do you think that's a fair characterization of what we're about here?
Yeah, certainly. I think that does characterise it. The programme of the Welsh Communists is called Real Power for the People of Wales. Although it's certainly asked for a transfer of powers, an increase in powers to the Senedd and the Welsh Government, it asks for much more than that. It asks for a shift in power away from owners and shareholders to public organisations, and to work the more decisions about the allocation of resources, about the allocation of time, that are taken by a democratic means. The less we rely on the market mechanism. Ultimately, I think we need to address the question of ownership, but it's by replacing the means of production, placing the means of production in common ownership, that we challenge capitalism. The democratic mechanism will be the only method for determining allocation once the market mechanism is defeated.
Thank you for that there, David. Right, here's a question for you both. How do we stop the executive of the state being nothing but a committee for the management of the affairs of the bourgeoisie, as I believe somebody once said? So, apart from abolishing the bourgeoisie completely, how do we ensure democracy spreads outside Parliament so people have genuine representation, participation, and their voices given to the many, who are excluded from the current system? Johnny, over to you on that one, please. Another big question.
Yep, indeed. Thanks, comrade. I think as I referred to at the start, it's important to emphasise that communists don't have any illusions about so-called democracy under capitalism, the lack of any scope for meaningful democracy under capitalism, and we also don't have the ambition to rescue the legitimacy of the ruling class parliamentary system in Britain. We're clear it's something that we ruthlessly criticise, and something that we're fighting to replace with a truly democratic socialist system. But we're also clear that one of the ruling class is its own political form of struggle, and one of the key elements of the political struggle for communists, for the left and the Labour movement, has to be, and always has been, the struggle to defend and expand the hard-won democratic freedoms that working people do have in this country. And you can bet that the ruling class are consistently and constantly fighting to do the reverse, that they're wanting to claw back as much of these hard-won freedoms as possible. We've seen that in pretty starkly illustrated in the recent period with Tory attempts to increase police powers, and also their continuing drive to centralise government and undermine any scope for them to be challenged. So we're clear that the movement for socialist and progressive change does have to have at its heart the struggle for increased democratic rights, and to draw in all elements of the working class who have been marginalised from the limited democratic process that we do have. So some of the key priorities, I think, for that movement, for the mass movement, going forward in the current period, have to be, the restoration of a lot of the civil liberties, or all of the civil liberties that have been eroded by Tory and also by Labour governments over the recent decades. We need to repeal the vicious anti-trade union laws that we have in this country. I think, referring back to my earlier point about the really toxic, cancerous role that the privately owned monopoly media have, we need to break up monopoly media, make sure it's not the case that it's owned, I think, by just about 4 people, and that we replace that with democratic forms of media ownership, such as we see with the Morning Star. I think we would also want to drive forward the struggle for proportional representation, which has been for a long time neglected in this country. But I think proportional representation in our electoral reform at all levels need to be a priority. As a young communist, I'm always going to raise the argument, something that we have in Scotland already, but is lowering the voting age to 16. And I think it goes without saying, we need to keep in the crosshairs the abolition of the archaic and anti-democratic House of Lords. So all these demands and many more besides them have to be part and parcel of the mass movement across Britain for socialist change. And that's got to be a movement that's based in our communities, our workplaces and our campuses.
I think it's a very important point that isn't made enough, in that we have a very centralised system now, and that we have a government which is intent on drawing power into itself in an extremely undemocratic way. When you have proper local democracy in countries like Wales and Scotland, and also in the regions of England, which is something that we'll cover in a separate podcast, you have alternative centres of power and authority which can fight against a centralised government which is becoming to abuse its power. And I think that's an important element to make here. David, what's your view on that?
I think that's absolutely key and important point. I think very much we need to see that democracy shifts to being much more direct, so that the decisions that we make at local level are about plans, constructions, the delivery of services, and that we get away fundamentally from the idea that democracy is a process whereby you select someone that then goes and makes decisions for you. I think very much we need to get to the situation where we understand our electoral representatives as there to do a particular job, that job's defined in popular debate in the run-up to the election period, and that if they fail to carry out that they're able to be recalled and we can replace them in a democratic way. Because at the moment, I think we're too much bound to a situation where the winner of the popularity contest can do whatever they like in terms of decision making for the next 5 years, and there's no recourse for effective protests against that. That's a really damaging situation.
Yeah, you raised an interesting point there as well about the elected representatives, and I guess we're getting back to the no democracy without socialism argument here, because so many of our elected representatives on the Tory side, and also the Labour side too, are landlords. And they will be obviously averse to anything which affects the rights of landlords. And quite a few obviously have interest in the financial sector. And when you look at something which is affecting us all right now, the housing crisis, well, basically housing emergency, when you have so many elected MPs who are the prisoners of the financial and the property sectors, then we're not going to get any change. Right, gentlemen, let's move on. Johnnie, over to you on this one. How would you characterise the main differences between your position and that of the Scottish Nationalist Party?
I suspect there could be some strong parallels between Scotland and Wales in this regard. I think, generally speaking, the Scottish National Party have really mastered the art of talking left and walking right. They do like to present themselves as a compelling force for soft left and social democratic politics in Scotland. But if you really look at their legacy over the past 15 years, it has been the politics of austerity. They've pursued the same fundamental economic plan and economic approach is the Tories, and that is one based on privatisation and a neoliberal economic model. And if you look at, the social demands that they like to point to having addressed, whether that's in terms of healthcare, education, and the other public services we rely on, there's a decade and a half of consistent failures and broken promises. Scottish Health Service is in crisis. The attainment gap in education has fallen. The promises on class sizes that I think they made when I was still a wee boy, still not achieved. And there are many, many more shameful examples besides that. Just for example, Scotland's record drug deaths, which is something that's just deteriorated under the SNP. Looking at the question of democracy, and of course for them that fundamentally centres around independence as well. I think the key difference is that for the SNP, they talk about independence, but if you look at their actual programme, it's very clearly independence in name only. All the key proposals from SNP on independence involved maintaining or even strengthening the control of external forces over the democratic will of the Scottish people. So on currency, there would have been continued membership or continued use of the pound sterling. That would have meant that most likely a perpetually Tory government would have had the power of economic veto over Scotland, and it also would have eroded the scope for united working class action across Britain in the face of that. Their whole model of independence now, and something they're very eager to use to win votes, is that a future independent Scotland, that's entirely predicated on re-entering the European Union. But they only admitted after the last referendum that, say, Scotland had entered the European Union as an independent state, under the EU's growth and stability treaties, that would have meant Scotland suffering even harsher austerity than Greece in the years that followed Scottish independence if it was to be part of the European Union. That continues to be the case. They've gone quieter on it since, but that's still fundamentally a core part of their argument. And what you see in that is that they would be quite content for Scotland to suffer a decade or so of brutal austerity in order to achieve their neoliberal economic vision of a future independent Scotland. Another key part of their plan, and something that's obviously very, very pertinent with what's happening in Eastern Europe just now, is that Scotland would have remained a member of the NATO aggressive nuclear first strike alliance, meaning that Scottish soldiers and Scottish funding would still be going towards imperialist wars abroad. So the short answer against that context is that Scotland's communists are fighting for a radical and social and economic transformation for the people of Scotland, and to challenge capitalism where it's organised, and that's in the City of London.
Yeah, certainly. If you don't control your own currency, you don't have independence. And if you're told by an external body that your public sector debt can be no more than 3% of GDP, then you don't have independence. David, give us your answer on that one from a Welsh viewpoint, please, sir.
I think, and as Johnny said, there's many parallels here. There's many similarities. The nationalist parties propose the breakup of British state institutions without proposing a challenge to British capital. And fundamentally, that's the problem that we face. There's no prospect of self-determination while we continue to be under the auspices of a largely united British capitalist system. I think that it's inconceivable to across Britain to consider a challenge succeeding without the united forces of the British Labour movement. I think it's the one and only chance that we have to defeat British capital is through united working class action right across the whole of Britain. It becomes vanishingly difficult to do that in the context that the nationalists would see, that Plaid Cymru would see imposed in Wales, which would essentially be a context in which Wales fought in a race to the bottom in terms of terms and conditions, in terms of trying to attract and woo the British capitalist forces. obviously that battle would be the kind of lead to the kind of redistribution of wealth would be in the wrong direction, but that was desperately needed. The idea of abandoning the links that we have with our comrades across Britain is a real problem if we want to see a redistribution from the southeast of England to Wales, into Scotland, and also ultimately to the poorer parts of England as well.
Yeah, a range of very good points there. I had big fallings out with a few people and a few members of the family regarding independence back in 2014. And I can understand why people in Scotland and Wales, but particularly in Scotland where the independence issue seems to be more current, would want to get away from a Tory-dominated England. But I think you make the point there, David, that if they were to do so, and if they were to join the European Union, they would end up in competition with the working class in England for investment. And they would probably try and cut wages and attract business away from England up to Scotland. So you get the working class competing against each other, which is kind of exactly what capitalism wants. And you could say it's what the European Union is all about. Right, gentlemen, last question here. I've got to admit to being very uneasy about any manifestation of tribalism or nationalism, whatever you call it. If you want to know why, then Christ, just look at human history. Tell me how you think your patriotism differs from your nationalism, and what makes you feel patriotic about Wales. Over to you first, David. Patriotism versus nationalism, and what makes you feel patriotic about Wales and maybe even about Britain?
I think earlier, we defined democracy as a collective decision making around allocation of resources. I think nations, along with communities and organisations, are an example of organic collectives, essentially. They come to being through a historical process. In the same historical process fostered competition between the nations. It included subjugation, exploitation, colonialism, imperialism. But the democratic deficit affects all of these societies. And it's nevertheless, it's manifest unevenly between different societies. So I think that the implementing democratic rights inescapably includes implementing suppressed national rights. I think it's only when the people of Wales can vote left and get a left government, rather than vote left and get a Tory government in Westminster, that we can say that we're moving in the right direction in terms of democracy. So I don't have a problem with my Welsh patriotism being manifest in the demands for a progressive federalist solution in Britain. It's equally as legitimate and as the demands coming from Scotland, but also from the different parts of England as well. I think it's that democratic deficit and economic exploitation which is the key thing for us to challenge.
Okay, thank you, Johnny. Over to you.
I think it's important to recognise at the outset that the Scottish nation, just like the Welsh nation or the English nation, isn't one unified, progressive, happy family. That's certainly how the SNP I think would like to portray it. There is a working class, and there's also elements of a ruling class. We would say that Scotland's ruling class is part of a wider British ruling class, and as Lenin pointed out, where there is a ruling class, there's a ruling class culture, but there is also a working class culture. Every nation has the basic elements of a democratic and a socialist culture, but every nation under capitalism also possesses a ruling class culture, which under capitalism is the dominant culture. So we say that it's for communists, socialists and trade unionists to identify, develop and build in Scotland's national culture only the democratic and the socialist elements. As I said, it's a dangerous myth that Scottish workers share any values or common interests with Scottish elements of Britain's ruling class just because we were born in the same country. But we've also got to acknowledge that patriotism is a powerful tool a powerful ideological and rhetorical tool, and that's not something that we can leave to the ruling class or indeed the forces of the far right. Because, you know, it goes without saying that there's a lot to be proud of in the history of Scotland and Britain's working classes. You know, our labour movement and you know, the forerunners of that, you know, going all the way back to Wat Tyler and the Diggers, bringing it forward to the defeat or the contribution of Britain's working classes to the defeat of Nazi fascism, to the UCS working after the war, all the way up to the struggles that are taking place across Britain today. You know, those are the heritage of working people across Britain. And I think those are things to be celebrated and to be proud of. And we also see, and we shouldn't forget, the examples of socialist and communist patriotism in the socialist countries that exist today, such as Cuba, China, and Vietnam, among others. We see there, that's a celebration of patriotism that's about the achievements of working people. It's not about national chauvinism or, you know, the preference of one nation over the other. And indeed, it's very often celebrated or attempts to celebrate the fact that different nationalities have come together to form multi-ethnic states. And it's something that also fundamentally celebrates internationalism between the working people of different nations. But a simpler and easier answer also would have been, I do feel particularly patriotic whenever I'm at Hampden or watching Scotland playing football on the telly. So, you know, we've all got our simplicity in that regard as well.
Oh yeah, there's no doubt that patriotism is a powerful tool, and you're quite right, we shouldn't leave it to the bourgeoisie. Gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for that. This has been CommieCast. We are anti-fascist, anti-racist, but very much for the working class, irrespective of which country they come from. Thank you very much, comrades, and thanks to you for listening. Cheers.